Okay, so we are on section number 5, urbanization, working, and living conditions. The first thing that we're going to talk about is working conditions, and we're going to talk about kids first, because children as young as 6 years old, and I've even heard of some 5-year-olds, were working 12 to 14 hours a day, and they were oftentimes not allotted any break time. So they were working on heavy and dangerous equipment, and they got paid diddly. They did not get paid anything. It was very, very low, and we're going to look at that in a second. If you were an orphan, you actually didn't get paid at all. You had to work for free. If these children arrived late, if they messed up, if they were working too slow, if they were tired, they were physically punished. So they were physically beaten and hurt to get them to work as hard as they possibly could. And oftentimes the parents didn't really have a choice whether or not they could send their kids to work, because they needed the money. They needed as much help as they could get in their families. So here we can see really iconic photographs. A lot of times children were used in these brand new factories because they were so tiny and their hands were so small that they could climb around on these machines, and they could fit their hands in places where adults couldn't necessarily, which was spectacularly dangerous. It was so dangerous for these kids. Many were injured. Here you can see the newsies. These are the newsboys standing in front of the United States Capitol. Tony's 8, Dan's 9, Joey's 10, and John is 12, or 11, I'm sorry. So we've got an 8-year-old selling a newspaper. So here we have a photograph. First of all, you can see how dusty and dirty it is in this environment. And this is at a coal company. Imagine if little kids were sitting with this dust and dirt. This gets inside of their lungs and makes them sick. And you can see here these men standing over top of these kids, and they're holding these big sticks here. These are to poke them and prod them, or they would kick them to get them to work faster, to get them to stop falling asleep. It was really abusive. It was an abusive situation for these kids. And here we've got some young kids working on the knitting machines in Tennessee. And then our last picture, this is Manuel. He is 5 years old, and he is standing on oyster shells. He was a shrimp picker, so he worked in like the seafood industry. He was not even able to speak or understand English. He just kind of worked all day. He wasn't allowed to go to school or anything like that. So working conditions weren't just bad for kids, they were bad for adults too. You've got more inventions, and with more inventions that means that there's more low-skilled or unskilled jobs, and I told you that those are actually paid less than skilled labor. With the increase of child labor, children were better to get to work for you because they were cheaper. So oftentimes adults were competing against children to try to get these jobs and these wages. We talked about dangerous and unsanitary working conditions for the kids. It was the same thing for the adults. They had low and unfair wages. They weren't allowed breaks. And these business leaders were actually making tons of money, and they did not share any of that wealth with the people that worked for them. Down here at the bottom it says that they treated workers like machines. When they failed, they got rid of them, and that was 100% true. If you got hurt on the job, oftentimes you were forced to continue working or get fired. So here's a really eye-opening compare and contrast. Andrew Carnegie, which we've already talked about before, he made over $20 million in 1899. If you look at the other side of this chart, child laborers were making 27 cents a day in 1899. So you can see women were making a little over $250 a year. Men weren't even making $500 a year. I told you there were no breaks. If they got hurt on the job, which is workers' compensation, they were not paid to go to the hospital. They were actually either fired or forced to continue working. They didn't get vacation days, and oftentimes they either had Sunday off or no days off at all. So terrible working conditions. So some comparing and contrasting here. This is Andrew Carnegie's home. It's huge. It's obviously a mansion. Here is Rockefeller's home. And this is just Vanderbilt's summer home. So this is just where he goes to spend his summer days. So now let's look at tenement buildings. These are where the immigrants and these city dwellers, these farmers that came from these rural places into these urban areas, were forced to live because that's all that they could afford. So here are two examples of tenement buildings, and here's another one. You see some officials in there investigating. This is a tiny room. You can see that guy's head is pretty much reaching the ceiling, and it is filthy in that home. It's not because the people were filthy, it's because so many people were living in such small living quarters. So the reason why living conditions were not great was because of this rapid urbanization. The city expanded so quickly that there was overcrowding, crime, pollution, there were no sanitation departments, and there were tons of safety issues. So they didn't have like a sewage system, so people were getting sick a lot. It was a really bad environment. So these immigrants coming from Europe and Asia, and these migrants coming from the South, as well as the people that originally lived there, were all trying to find places to live in the city that they could afford on that very low wage that they were earning. So tenement buildings, and you need to know the definition of these, are these narrow, tiny, cramped apartment buildings. They are very unsafe. Oftentimes, well, they didn't have electricity at that time, but oftentimes they also didn't have any type of plumbing or running water, so they had to kind of use like a bucket to use the bathroom in. There was no heat, there was no light, there was no ventilation. It was very bad living conditions. And to kind of illustrate, I'm not going to ask you on a test this statistic, but to illustrate how prevalent or how many of these apartment buildings or tenement buildings there were, you can see down here I said by 1900, 2.3 million people were living in these tenement buildings in New York City. This is 2/3 of the total New York City population. So some more photographs here of the tenement buildings. This is a family, and you can see this photograph looks like it's a very small room, and it absolutely is. This entire family lives in this one room. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of them living in this one tiny room. And then another photograph of like what a typical city street would look like during this period of urbanization in the late 1890s. So you are finished with video number 3. Congrats. You should answer the 3 questions on your guided notes and make sure you get my attention so I can stamp you when you're finished. Bye.